The year was 1879, and the world was different. The streets of small towns around Boston were quiet and heavy with the weight of routine life. People lived simple lives. They worked hard during the day and prayed at night, hoping their children would grow up strong and safe in such a town. There was a studio, a modest place with wooden floors that creaked when anyone walked on them. A place where families came to freeze their memories in glass and paper for generations to look back at the same way we scroll through pictures today. That day a family walked into the studio. The father, tall and stern, dressed in a coat that smelled faintly of smoke from the fireplace at home. The mother, gentle, her eyes carrying both warmth and exhaustion, and their little daughter, small and delicate, clutching her mother's hand tightly, as if the world outside the door still frightened her. They sat on the simple wooden chairs the studio owned, and the photographer, a man with steady hands, adjusted his old camera. He lit the oil lamps and reminded them not to move for even a second. The air was thick with silence. Only the tick of a small clock on the wall filled the room. The little girl shifted nervously, her dress rustling softly while her father whispered for her to sit still. The mother placed her hand gently on the child's shoulder, calming her. Then the shutter clicked. The sound was sharp and heavy like a hammer on metal. And then it was done, a moment, frozen in time forever. The family stood. The father nodded, satisfied. The mother gave a faint smile. The child looked around as though she had heard something strange, but no one paid attention. The photographer carefully took the glass plate and began the process of developing the image slowly. The shapes began to appear, shadows turning into bodies, outlines turning into faces. The picture came to life. At first glance, the photo seemed normal, a stiff family portrait from the Victorian era. Everyone looked straight at the camera. The father serious, the mother graceful, the daughter nervous. Nothing strange, just the kind of photograph you would expect to find in an old attic, dusty and forgotten. Yet the photographer kept staring. His hands began to tremble. His heart beat faster, because there in the background in the dim light stood something else. A figure tall and still like a man, but darker. Softer, not fully. There his breath caught in his throat. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it must be an error. Perhaps a smudge on the plate or a trick of the lamps, but no. The shape was clear. A shadow with the faint suggestion of a face, features blurred but unmistakably human. And worse than that, the shadow seemed to lean toward the little girl, as if watching her closely, as if waiting. The photographer looked around the studio, his eyes darting to the corners. Every lamp flickered faintly, but the room was empty. Only the echoes of his own fear filled the silence. The family had already left, unaware of what had appeared behind them. They would go home, thinking their portrait was ordinary, never suspecting that something had chosen to reveal itself only after the moment was captured forever. He stood there, sweating, his mouth dry, whispering to himself that it was impossible. But deep inside he knew photographs were known to catch things unseen by the human eye. Little accidents, little ghosts that clung to the living Victorian society. Was fascinated by such things. People believed cameras could trap spirits. People paid money for spirit photography. But this was different. This was not staged. No one had asked for this. And the shadow was too real, too focused. The man thought of telling the family, but the words stuck in his throat. What would he say? How could he explain that something had been standing with them, silently watching, as if it belonged there, and yet did not? He wrapped the photograph carefully, hiding it away. But the image haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure waiting behind the innocent family, staring through the thin veil between worlds. Days later, he developed other plates, hoping to push the thought aside. But each time he looked, he imagined the same shadow lurking in the corners of his work, though only this portrait truly carried it. The figure seemed attached not to him, but to the family, and most of all, to the girl. The photographer wondered if they had seen it before. If perhaps the little girl's nervousness that day was not from sitting still, but from sensing what none of them could see with their eyes, only with the cruel honesty of the camera. He began to question his own sanity, replaying that afternoon again and again in his head, the smell of the oil lamps, the sound of the shutter, the way the mother held her daughter close. Had there been a draft in the room? Had he felt something cold brush his shoulder? The more he thought, the less he trusted his memory, the more he believed that shadow was not just an illusion. It had been there, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, waiting to be caught. The photograph sat hidden but alive in his dark room, its edges curling slightly, the chemicals faintly staining the wood beneath. Yet the shadow never faded. It was not a trick of exposure, not a fading blur. It remained crisp as if etched into the glass itself, permanent, undeniable. And so the question lingered, who or what had stepped into that portrait? Why had it chosen that moment, that family, and above all, what did it want? From the small girl who sat stiffly in her chair, unaware that a shadow leaned so close behind her. The studio belonged to Elijah Morton, and in that time his name carried both curiosity and unease. He was a photographer. Yes, but not just any photographer. People whispered that he had a taste for things others avoided. He was rumored to dabble in spirit photography, something both thrilling and terrifying in the Victorian age, when the line between science and the supernatural was blurry and people longed to believe that death was not the end. Victorians were obsessed with seances. They gathered in dim, candlelit rooms with mediums who promised to call the dead. They sat with trembling hands as tables shifted on their own, as cold drafts swept across their faces as whispers came from nowhere. People paid dearly for photographs that claimed to capture spirits hovering near the living. Death portraits were common. Two families losing children to illness and fever would pose with their lifeless bodies as if freezing their presence forever on film. This was not strange in their eyes. This was love. It was memory, and it was comfort in this world. Elijah found his place. His studio was small. Wooden walls lined with curtains heavy to block the light. A faint smell of chemicals clung to the air bottles of developer and fixer stacked carelessly on shelves. Neighbors said the place was haunted. They said they saw shadows moving behind the curtains when no one was there. They swore strange shapes bled through his plates, faces that did not belong to those being photographed. Sometimes a blurred hand rested on a shoulder. Sometimes a figure leaned in too close, though no one in the studio had seen it at the time. Yet Elijah himself swore he was not a fraud. He said others faked spirit photographs by using double exposure or hidden assistance, but his work was different. He claimed he never tried to summon the strange shapes. They simply came through uninvited. And he felt cursed more than gifted, because each time a figure appeared, he could not sleep. For nights, he would sit awake listening to the creaks of the wooden floorboards, convinced that someone had followed him home from his dark room. And then came the portrait of 1879. A family, stiff and quiet, the husband, stern, the wife, graceful, the daughter trembling in her chair. Elijah had seen many photographs with smudges, shadows, tricks of the lens, but when this glass plate developed, he froze. His hands went cold, the hairs on his neck rose. He stared, because this shadow was not vague. It was not soft. It was sharp, with detail, as if it had wanted to be seen. Its shoulders, its outline, its faint but chilling face. Elijah leaned closer, his eyes wide. The figure was tall. It stood directly behind the family, its gaze not scattered but focused, its head tilted slightly down toward the little girl. It was not looking at the mother. It was not looking at the father. It was staring only at her, the child whose nervous shifting had seemed so small a detail. Now made sense. Elijah wondered, had she felt it? Had she known something stood so close, unseen by anyone else? He wiped his hands on his apron, muttering to himself. He checked the plate again and again, running his fingers across the surface as though touch could erase what he saw. But the figure remained unshaken by denial. No trick of light could create eyes like that. Eyes that bore into the girl with a hunger both patient and cruel. He thought of the stories the neighbors told, the ones he tried to laugh off late at night but could not fully dismiss, tales of how shadows sometimes lingered in his windows, how people walking past his studio crossed the street to avoid the strange chill they felt under his roof. He had lived with the rumors for years, but now he felt the truth pressing against his chest. This was not rumor. This was evidence staring back at him from the glass. He whispered aloud to himself, trying to reason. Maybe it was a double exposure. Maybe his hand had slipped. Maybe the chemicals had reacted strangely. But inside he knew his chemicals were precise. His hand had not slipped, and the figure was too alive, too deliberate in its presence. This was not an accident. This was an arrival. And most terrifying of all, Elijah realized this figure had chosen where to stand. It was not drifting. It was not scattered. It was placed firmly behind the family, as if part of them, as if it had been waiting for the shutter to open, waiting for the moment it could step forward into permanence. The girl's wide, nervous eyes haunted him. She had looked restless that day, and now he wondered, did she see what the rest could not? Her father stiff, her mother calm, but the child uneasy, fidgeting, shifting as though something brushed against her back, as though she knew a gaze was on her. A gaze too heavy to ignore, yet impossible to speak about in a room where no one else could see. And so Elijah sat in the dim light of his studio, the photograph in his trembling hands, knowing deep inside that he had captured something he could never explain, not to the family, not to his neighbors, not even to himself, because this was not just another rumor. This was proof, and the proof was terrifying. It was not a trick of light. It was not chance. It was a shadow with a face staring straight at the girl, as if she belonged to it. When the family returned to the studio to see their portrait, they expected nothing more than a simple memory, a stiff picture to hang in their parlor, but what awaited them inside Elijah's dim little studio was something none of them could have imagined. The moment the photograph was revealed, the room seemed to grow colder. The lamps flickered slightly and the air grew heavy. The mother leaned in to look, her eyes scanning the faces of her husband, her daughter, herself, and then her eyes drifted upward toward the shadow standing just behind them. She gasped so sharply that Elijah thought she might cry out, but instead her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor. The smell of ammonia from the developing chemicals filled her nose. As she lay fainted, her hands trembling even in unconsciousness, the husband rushed forward, his face turning pale, yet his jaw clenched with anger. He stared at the glass plate, and for a moment his mind refused to accept what he saw. Then fury overtook fear. He demanded in a voice rough and broken that Elijah destroy the plate at once, smash it, grind it, burn it, anything to erase the image. But Elijah refused. His hands clutched the fragile plate like a man holding scripture. His eyes wild, his voice shaking but firm. He said, "This is evidence. This is proof of something beyond death. You don't understand. This is not an illusion. This is not a mistake. We must keep it. We must study it." The husband shouted again, his fists tight, veins straining at his neck, demanding again and again to destroy it. But Elijah shook his head, his obsession already taking root. Then a small voice broke the storm. The daughter, only 6 years old, stood near the fainted body of her mother, her little hands gripping the edge of her dress. Her eyes wide, not with confusion, but with recognition. She looked at the shadow in the photograph and whispered in her fragile, childlike tone, "Why is he following me again? The words fell like stones into a well. The sound carried and echoed in the silence that followed. The husband stopped shouting. Elijah froze. The mother, though unconscious, twitched, as if some part of her still heard it. The air was still. Everyone stared at the child. No one spoke because the weight of her words crushed the room again. She had not asked, "Who is that?" She had not asked, "What is that?" She had asked, "Why is he following me again?" As if she had seen him before, as if this was not the first time, as if this dark shape, this presence had been with her longer than any of them dared to imagine. The father knelt down to her, his lips trembling, but no words came. He wanted to ask, but something in his heart stopped him. Something told him he did not want to know. He pulled her close, clutching her in silence while his eyes darted back to the shadow frozen forever in the glass. Elijah could barely breathe. His mind screamed. With questions, he wanted to demand an answer from the girl. What she meant, what she had seen, where she had seen it. But the fear of her reply kept his mouth sealed shut. The girl looked calm in that moment, calmer than anyone else in the room, as if she had already accepted something, as if this figure had been with her not for moments, but for years. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply lowered her gaze as though tired of a secret she had been carrying far too long, and the silence remained thick, suffocating. No one asked her what she meant, because deep down, each of them already feared they knew the answer. The father clung to his child, refusing to meet Elijah's eyes. The mother slowly stirred her faint, broken by a faint whisper of air. She woke in confusion, but no one dared explain her collapse. Only the photograph sat between them, its shadow burning itself deeper into their minds, a truth too heavy to speak. That night, when they left the studio, the husband carried his daughter in his arms, her small face pressed against his chest. The mother weak but walking beside him. None of them looked back at Elijah, who stood in the doorway, watching them go. The plate still safe in his hands, the image etched into his memory as much as onto the glass. He whispered to himself again and again, "Why is he following her again? Why again? What does it mean?" The question rattled through his mind long after they disappeared into the fog of the evening street. He knew then that the shadow was not just some passing trick, not a wandering spirit caught by chance. It had intent. It had history. It had chosen the girl for reasons no one dared to uncover, and Elijah could feel in his bones that this was only the beginning. Within a month, the husband died suddenly from what doctors called a fever of the blood. At his funeral, several guests swore they saw a tall shadow standing in the church balcony. The widow burned with grief but refused to leave her home. She hung the photograph in her parlor, covering the shadow with a draped cloth. She claimed if the picture was destroyed, he will come out fully. Elijah Morton began to lose his mind. It started slowly, like a crack in glass that spreads until the whole surface is shattered. He was once a man respected for his craft. Even if his work carried whispers of the uncanny, people still came to him for portraits, because his hand was steady and his plates were sharp. But after that photograph, after the shadow appeared behind the family, something inside him shifted, and it never shifted back. He told his colleagues about it. First, men he trusted, men who understood the fragile balance of chemicals and light. He tried to explain with words that stumbled from his lips. Trembling, he said it was not a trick of light. It was not a mistake. He swore that when he left the studio that night, the shadow followed him home. He described how he felt a weight behind him as he walked through the dark streets, how his lantern flickered with every step, how the air felt colder whenever he looked over his shoulder, and though the street was empty, he knew he was not alone. At first, his colleagues laughed. nervous little chuckles, brushing his words aside as if he were telling a ghost story to children. But then Elijah began to bring them his negatives plate after plate, showing the same thing again and again, even when there was no one else in the studio, even when he photographed nothing but an empty chair or a bare wall. The shadow was there, always there, standing tall, sometimes further in the background, sometimes closer. Its faint, blurred face always turned toward the lens, always watching. The other photographers whispered among themselves. They said Elijah was cursed. They said he had tampered too long with the border between the living and the dead. Some avoided him altogether, crossing the street to keep away from his darkroom. Others pretended sympathy but refused to touch his plates for fear the shadow would cling to them too. Elijah saw it in their eyes, the same doubt, the same fear, and it ate at him. He stopped sleeping. The nights became unbearable. He would light every lamp in his home until the rooms glowed like fire. But still he felt the presence moving through the corners. He heard the floorboards creak. Though no one walked them, he saw his reflection in the glass of his windows, warped by another shape standing just behind him. He took to writing in his journal late into the night, scratching words across paper as if recording them could drain them from his mind. The pages filled with ramblings, at first descriptions of the figure, its movements, its stillness, then theories about what it was, where it came from. Sometimes he convinced himself it was a ghost, other times a demon. Then he decided it was not a spirit at all, but something older, something nameless that used shadows the way a man might wear a coat. But the most frightening thing, he wrote again and again, was that it was choosing him. It had singled him out, and there was no way to turn its gaze elsewhere. The entries grew darker with each passing week. He wrote about how he felt it standing over his bed as he tried to sleep, how he dreamed of the little girl from the portrait, her wide eyes staring back at him, whispering that the shadow would not leave until it had taken what it wanted. He described waking up to the smell of smoke, though no fire burned in his hearth. He described hearing knocks on his door, though no one was ever there. And each time he opened it, he felt the cold rush of air, as if something had just stepped inside. Then came the night of the fire. No one knew how it started. Neighbors said they heard a scream, a sound so sharp it cut through the quiet streets. Then flames roared from the windows, devouring the wooden walls. In minutes, the fire brigade arrived, but the studio was gone by dawn, reduced to blackened ruins. They found almost nothing left. No portraits, no chemicals, no plates. Only fragments of glass melted into the ash, and one half-burned journal that someone had hidden beneath the floorboards. The journal was the only testimony of Elijah's final days, the last entry written in a hand so frantic the ink bled across the page. It read, "The shadow has no master. It chooses its host." These were his final words, the last thought he left to the world, before the flames took everything else. And so the legend grew. People said the shadow had burned the studio down itself to erase the traces. People said Elijah had set the fire in madness, trying to destroy what he could not escape. Others whispered that he never died at all, that the shadow took him whole, leaving nothing behind but ruin and rumor. But the journal was real. The words were there, and whoever read them felt the same chill that Elijah must have felt in his final moments, the sense that something unseen was standing just behind them, waiting. Years later, when the weight of time had pressed heavy on her shoulders and her body had grown frail, the widow of that cursed family sat in the dim light of a church, her voice thin, her breath uneven, her heart knowing that death was close. She called for her priest not to pray for her health, for she knew no prayer could stop what was coming, but to release a truth she had carried in silence, a truth that had poisoned her days and haunted her nights ever since the photograph. The priest, an old man himself with a face carved by years of listening to confessions, walked softly into her room. He pulled a chair beside her bed and waited, his hands folded quietly. He had heard confessions of theft, of betrayal, of lies. But the look in her eyes told him this would be heavier than any sin whispered in his chapel. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion and began to speak. She said the shadow that had appeared behind her. Family was not random, not some wandering spirit. She said it was a man she had once known, a man she had once loved before her marriage, before her child, before all the life she had built. She told him of her first fiancé, a young man handsome and full of fire who had drowned mysteriously in the river only days before their wedding. She remembered the way the town had whispered about it, some saying it was an accident, some suggesting darker things, but she had known deep in her heart that he had not left peacefully, with trembling hands. She told the priest how she had stood by the river the morning they pulled his body out, how she had felt the cold wind around her, how she had whispered his name and in that moment sworn she heard a voice whisper back. Not words, not clear, but a presence, one that never let her go. She said, she married another man, she built another family, but she never stopped feeling the cold of that river, never stopped feeling the eyes of the man who had drowned watching her from the shadows. And then her voice cracked. Her eyes filled with tears as she swore to the priest that on the night before her wedding she had dreamt of him standing at the foot of her bed, his clothes wet, his hair dripping, his face pale. He had said to her, "If you love another, if you give your heart again, it will not be you. I haunt, it will be your children." She woke screaming but told no one. She thought it was grief, she thought it was madness, but the warning had been real. The priest listened, his breath shallow, his mind heavy with the weight of her words. She told him that when the photograph was taken and the shadow appeared, she knew immediately who it was. She knew the tilt of his head. She knew the presence. She had felt all her life. She fainted because she recognized the curse standing over her daughter. And she had lived with that knowledge for years, too afraid to speak it, too afraid to break the silence that perhaps kept it contained. She confessed that every night since her husband died, she had prayed not for herself, but for her child. She prayed that the shadow would lose interest, that it would fade, that the curse would weaken with time. But each time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice, the drowned man whispering from the river that he had not forgotten his vow. The priest leaned forward, his hand gently gripping hers. He wanted to ask why she had kept it secret, why she had never spoken before. But her eyes answered before her lips. Did she? Was afraid. Afraid that saying it aloud would give it power. Afraid that the moment she confessed the shadow would grow stronger and take what it desired sooner. And so she had buried the truth deep inside her heart, letting it rot her from within, but now with her breath thin, her body weak. She said she could not carry it any longer. She told the priest it was her fault. Her daughter's life, her fate, all tied to a promise made by a spirit scorned by a man who died too soon. She whispered that she could feel him even then standing in the corner of her room, waiting for her last breath, ready to collect what was his. The priest murmured prayers, trying to soothe her, but his hands trembled because deep down he believed her. The way her voice shook, the way her eyes darted to the shadows in the room as if seeing something he could not. He knew this was not the rambling of a dying woman. This was confession of a curse that had lived too long. When she finally closed her eyes, when her chest stopped rising, the room felt colder. The priest swore he heard the faint sound of water dripping, though the room was dry. He looked at the corner where her eyes had kept straying, and for just a moment, just a flicker, he thought he saw something tall and dark, lingering before it faded into nothingness. And so her secret died with her, though the priest never forgot her words. He never forgot her trembling voice as she spoke of the drowned man who vowed to haunt not her, but her Children, a curse carved not into flesh or stone, but into blood itself. A curse that would not die with her, but would carry on through the ones she loved most. The little girl grew up, but she never truly escaped the weight that hung over her from the day that photograph was taken. Her childhood was quiet, yet always strange. She would laugh, she would play, but there were moments when her eyes would drift into the corners of rooms as if searching for something no one else could see. Moments when her smile would fade suddenly, as if a cold breath had brushed across her neck. Her mother tried to shelter her, wrapping her in prayer and silence. But a curse once spoken does not weaken with time. It only waits. By the time she was 16, the whispers began to spread among her friends. One of them, a girl who spent the night at her home, swore that as they lay in her bedroom, whispering secrets by candlelight, she saw him, a tall man, standing in the corner, unmoving, his face lost in the darkness, his presence heavy as stone. The girl screamed, pointing, trembling. But when the daughter turned to look, there was nothing there, only shadows and walls. The daughter insisted she saw nothing, but deep inside, she felt it. She felt the weight pressing against her even in absence. That night her friend fled the house, refusing to ever return, and from then on others too began to sense what followed. Her animals shied away, dogs barking at empty air, cats hissing with arched backs, doors opening, slightly on their own, when she entered rooms. Even strangers on the street sometimes glanced over her shoulder as if someone walked too close behind her. And yet she never turned to see, because she knew that if she looked, she might finally find what had been promised to her long before she could understand. At 18, the tragedy that had been circling finally arrived. She vanished without a trace. One evening she left her room. She left her mother's house, and she was never seen again. No footprints, no struggle, no signs of escape. She was simply gone. The town searched the woods, the river, the abandoned mills, but her name echoed only in the wind. Her mother collapsed in grief, screaming that the curse had taken her, screaming that the shadow had finally come to collect what it was owed. The only thing left behind was the portrait, the cursed photograph still hanging in her mother's house, the same one that had been covered for years by cloth torn and faded by time. But now when the neighbors entered the house to comfort the grieving widow, they saw that the cloth had been ripped away, not carefully, not by hand, but as if torn with violent force. The photograph exposed once again to open air, the family stiff and pale in their Victorian pose, and behind them the shadow still there, darker than it had been before. Those who looked closely swore that it had changed. The figure was sharper, clearer, its features more defined, its posture leaning closer, as though it had moved forward across the years, and most unsettling of all, its mouth, once blurred, now curved upward in the faintest smile. Not a smile of warmth, but of triumph. The smile of something that had waited patiently and finally claimed what was promised. The mother tried to tear it from the wall, tried to smash it, but each time her hands touched the frame, she felt ice crawl across her skin. She screamed, she begged priests to burn it, but when fire was brought near the glass, never cracked the flames, licked at the frame, yet left no mark, as if the photograph itself refused to be destroyed, and so it remained hanging, a silent witness to the fate of the daughter and the curse of the drowned man. The townsfolk avoided the house. Children dared each other to run up to the porch, but none dared step inside, and the story grew darker. With every telling, some swore that at night, if you stood outside and stared through the window, you could see the photograph glowing faintly as if lit from within. And if you stared long enough, the shadow inside would shift slightly, just enough to prove that it was not frozen in glass, but alive, watching, waiting. The mother withered in her grief, the loss of her child breaking her spirit. But she never left. That house she stayed with. The portrait she stayed with, the shadow as if chained to it. And those who visited her in her final years said she no longer spoke of her daughter. She no longer spoke of her husband. She spoke only of him, the figure in the photograph, the one who smiled now as if mocking her, the one who had promised her long ago that her children would be his, and when she finally died alone in that house, the portrait remained untouched, still hanging, still smiling, still waiting in 1923. When the house that once belonged to the widow finally stood empty and rotting, a distant relative came forward to claim what little was left. The house itself sagged with age, its windows broken, its doors swollen with damp, the wallpaper peeling. In long strips, the smell of dust and mildew heavy in the air. No one had lived there in years. No one had dared because of the stories that clung to the walls. But families die and property passes. And so this relative came not out of sentiment but out of duty and perhaps a little greed. He walked through the rooms with a handkerchief pressed to his nose, glancing at the broken furniture and the ruined carpets, muttering to himself about what could be sold, what could be burned, what could be forgotten. The house seemed hollow yet restless, as if the silence inside was not empty but full of things unseen. He climbed the narrow staircase to the attic and pushed open the heavy door. The smell of dust was overwhelming, but it was not dust. Alone, something else lingered in that air. A chill like damp stone, a weight like breath against the back of his neck, and then he saw it propped against the far wall, half covered in cobwebs. Its frame rotting, its glass cracked yet still intact. The portrait, the family frozen forever in their Victorian pose, their faces pale, their clothes stiff, and behind them the shadow still there. Though time had eaten at the edges of the photograph, the figure remained untouched, dark, unwavering, alive in its stillness. The relative did not know the story. Not fully. He had heard whispers about a haunting, about misfortune. But he did not believe. He thought of money, not curses. She took the portrait down, brushing the dust from its surface, and for a moment, as he turned it in the dim attic light, he swore he saw movement. Not sharp, not dramatic, but subtle, as if the tall figure had leaned forward ever so slightly, as if acknowledging him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and told himself it was a trick of the crack in the glass. Nothing more, nothing worse. The portrait left the house with him, carried in the back of his wagon, while the rooms it had haunted for decades sank further into ruin. He sold it soon after to a collector of oddities, a man who delighted in the strange and the grotesque, a man who filled his gallery with shrunken heads, bones of rare beasts, masks from forgotten rituals. And now he added the portrait to his collection, proud of its grim aura, proud of its age. The collector hung it in a private gallery where only select guests were allowed to wander and admire the macabre treasures he kept. He would pause often before the portrait, speaking to his guests about its history, whispering that the family who sat in the photograph had all met strange ends, that the widow had spoken of curses, that the child had vanished, that the house had decayed into nothing more than a skeleton. And always he would point to the shadow in the background with a smile and say, "This figure is why it belongs here." But in the months that followed, the collector began to notice something. He would stand before the photograph late at night, glass of wine in hand, and he would swear the shadow was not the same as before. He would swear its shoulders had shifted, its head tilted at a new angle, as if it no longer looked at the family in front of it but at him directly. And the longer he stared, the more certain he became that the shadow had stepped forward ever so slightly closer to the foreground. At first he laughed it away. He told his guests that it was the cracked glass distorting the image. But then others began to whisper the same thing. His friends would lean close, squinting and muttering that the shadow seemed nearer. Then before that, its outline had grown sharper, that its faint blurred face looked more like a grin. And some swore that if you turned your back to it, you could feel the weight of eyes boring into you, as if someone stood inches away. Though when you spun around, the gallery was empty. The collector kept it still. He would not sell. He would not destroy. Instead, He wrote small notes about it in his journals. He claimed it was alive in some way, that time did not freeze it, but instead allowed it to move slowly, patiently, as though each year, each decade brought it one step closer to freedom. He believed the shadow was reaching forward, trying to escape the frame, trying to join the living, and so the portrait remained in his gallery a treasure. Among his horrors, a piece that unsettled even the bravest of his guests. They would stare at it only briefly before moving on, whispering to each other about the way the figure seemed to lean toward the edge of the photograph, as though any day it might step through and join them in the dim, quiet hall. In the 1970s, the portrait found its way out of the private gallery and into a museum of curiosities, a place already filled with unsettling relics and stories whispered more than spoken. The curators thought it would be a perfect addition. A Victorian photograph with a reputation for tragedy and superstition. Visitors loved such things, and the portrait went on display behind a thin sheet of glass mounted on the wall beneath dim, yellow lights. From the beginning, the staff noticed the air around the exhibit never felt normal. Guards reported that when they walked their nightly rounds, the temperature dropped near the frame cold enough to make their breath show in the air. Even when the rest of the hall stayed warm, they would rub their arms and hurry past, muttering that the thing made them feel watched. One guard swore he heard faint breathing when he stood too close. Another said he felt a tap on his shoulder only to turn and find no one there. The visitors, too, began to complain. Some would walk away, pale-faced, saying they had seen something wrong in the reflection. One after another, they whispered the same thing. The glass did not return their own faces. It showed another face, tall, hollow-eyed, standing directly behind them, no matter how crowded the room felt. In that moment, they were alone with the figure looming just at their shoulder, a man who did not belong. One woman screamed and nearly fainted. When she swore she saw his hand lift toward her before she turned away. The curators tried to dismiss it, calling it imagination, suggestion. But the whispers grew too frequent and too consistent. A journalist wrote a small piece about the cursed portrait, claiming that every photograph of the exhibit came out slightly blurred, as though the lens refused to capture it clearly. The museum liked the attention, until the night one of their own guards was found slumped against the wall near the portrait, his flashlight rolling on the floor, his lips moving in broken fragments of speech. When they bent close to listen, they heard him muttering over and over, "It followed me out. It followed me out." His eyes were wide open, unfocused, staring at nothing, though tears streaked down his face when they shook him. He screamed and would not return to his post. He left the job entirely and never came back. The museum doctor called it exhaustion. The curators called it hysteria. But the staff refused to work the night shift alone after that. Within weeks, the museum quietly pulled the portrait from the wall. There was no public announcement, no explanation, only the sudden absence of the frame where the photograph had hung. People noticed, asked questions, but received only vague replies. The official story was that it had been moved to storage, though whispers spread that the museum had locked it deep in the basement, far from visitors, far from anyone who might dare stand in front of it too long. But even in the silence of that basement where light bulbs flickered and pipes dripped slow water, the guards claimed the cold still gathered at the door, where the portrait lay behind boxes and tarps. One said that when he walked by, he heard knocking. From the other side, another swore he saw a shadow stretched long across the floor, even when the bulb above burned bright. No one wanted to be assigned to that level, and when they drew straws, the loser always cursed under his breath. The portrait had been taken from the house to the attic, from the attic to the gallery, from the gallery to the museum, and each time it left behind a trail of whispers and fear, as though it carried with it something alive and hungry, something that grew stronger each time new eyes dared to meet its gaze. Today, no one can say with certainty where the portrait rests. Some whisper it lies sealed in a private vault in New York, locked away with other cursed objects forgotten by collectors who fear what they cannot control. Others insist it was burned to ash long ago in some attempt to end the curse. But then again, Elijah's words from his ruined journal come back to mind. The shadow has no master. It chooses its host. If that was true, then fire would not destroy it. It would only free it. And maybe that is why the story refuses to die, because every few years the image reappears. A grainy scan, a blurry copy passed between collectors' forums and late-night threads. It surfaces on forgotten corners of the internet, and each time it does, new voices claim the same thing. When you look at it for too long, the shadow seems to lean closer. Not a trick of pixels, not an edit, but a pull. Something in the darkness, shifting, almost stepping forward toward you. People write that their screens feel colder, their rooms heavier. Some swear they see movement just outside their vision, a tall shape behind them that vanishes the moment they turn. One man confessed that after staring at the copy, he woke in the night to find a figure standing at the foot of his bed, watching, waiting, unmoving until dawn broke. He never looked at the picture again. He deleted every file but claimed he could still feel it when he closed his eyes. And so the question lingers, was the shadow ever bound to the portrait at all? Or was the portrait only a doorway, a window that let it pass from one soul to another? Maybe Elijah was right. Maybe the shadow does not belong to film or paper or glass. Maybe it belongs to whoever dares to notice it, whoever lingers on its outline too long, whoever reads stories like this and feels the urge to turn around and check the space just behind their shoulder, because in the end no one truly knows where the original photograph is hidden. Maybe buried deep in a vault, maybe rotting in storage, maybe waiting in some basement where a flickering bulb still hums, but the shadow itself is never lost. It only waits for a host. It only waits for an audience. And right now, as you read this, as you picture the family frozen in that Victorian studio, as you imagine the faint outline behind them leaning closer, you might already feel it too.